The tumultuous life of Edgar Allan Poe, the American writer, editor, and literary critic, began in Boston, Massachusetts on January 19, 1809. Poe was one of the early architects of detective fiction and is also considered a major contributor to the birth of science fiction. He was also among the first well-known American authors of fiction to attempt writing as a full-time job. The child of two actors, Poe never knew his parents. His father abandoned the family early on, and his mother died when he was a toddler. After her death, Edgar was taken in by a wealthy tobacco merchant and his wife, John and Frances Allen, in Richmond, Virginia. Edgar and Frances got along fine, but he never warmed to John, and the feeling it was mutual. Money was a main bone of contention between the pair as the boy grew into a man. The trouble began when Poe enrolled in a course at the University of Virginia. His foster father gave him $100, about $2,000 today, to cover living expenses for the year. With college expenses and his gambling habits, which he claimed was only a last-ditch attempt to raise more money to support himself, he quickly fell into debt. In the end, he quit university after a year and moved to Boston. There he tried to survive on odd jobs, but needed a form of steady income, so he enlisted in the army in 1827. Beyond that same year, he also published his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, with no real success. In enlisting in the army, he used the name Edgar Allan Poe and said he was 22 years old, even though he was just 18. Due to the debt that he had accumulated in college, a warrant had been issued for his arrest, and he wasn't keen on making it easy for the authorities to find him. First serving at Fort Independence in Boston, he was eventually moved to Fort Monroe in Virginia. Likely, Poe didn't care where he was, as long as he continued to get his $5 per month, about $100 today, from the military. At first it appeared that Poe would excel in the army. He thrived and was eventually promoted to sergeant major for artillery, which was the highest rank achievable by a non-commissioned individual. Still, Poe disliked army life. Only 2 years into his 5-year commitment, he explained his situation and asked for an early discharge. Lieutenant Howard, his commanding officer, agreed to allow him to leave the army before his time was up on one condition: he make amends with his foster father. Poe's foster father wasn't amenable at first, but a series of unfortunate events resulted in the death of Poe's foster mother and a softening of attitudes between the two men. After finding a replacement to finish his enlisted term, Poe was honorably discharged in 1829. He didn't end his military career there, however. Soon after his discharge, Poe enrolled in West Point and matriculated as a cadet in 1830. Just as he had in the army, Poe proved a diligent pupil, great with maths and languages, and well-suited to academy life. Poe's time at the academy was financed by his foster father John, meaning that Poe needed his foster father's permission in order to drop out if he wanted to. Unfortunately, Poe's relationship with his foster father was on the rocks again after John married his second wife, Louisa Patterson. Soon after the marriage, Poe learns that John had fathered illegitimate children with another woman, one of them 20 years his junior. It led to a row between the two, and Poe received a letter saying that his foster father wanted no further communication with him. An angry Poe sent a letter back letting him know about everything that had infuriated him over the years and demanding that he let Poe drop out of West Point. The letter ended with the ominous declaration that if he wasn't allowed to leave gracefully, he'd get himself kicked out. With no response from John, Poe set out to make good on his threat. The prestigious student fell from grace, racking up an impressive 44 offenses and 106 demerits in one term alone, followed by 66 offenses in 1 month the next term. He was court-martialed and tried at the beginning of February for gross neglect of duty. His various offenses included being absent from class parades, guard mounting, and church parades. He also didn't show up for academic classes and refused to obey officers' orders. There was also a rumor that he once turned up to drills in a belt and nothing else, but there's nothing in his official record to corroborate this. Interesting though such a stunt would have been, Poe's preferred method of mayhem was just not showing up to anything at all. Poe was, of course, found guilty of all charges and kicked out of West Point. He headed off to New York to pursue writing, but not before he'd gotten a little something extra out of the military first. He convinced over 100 cadets to donate money to fund the release of a new volume of poems, titled simply Poems. The book was dedicated to his fellow cadets. On that note, after leaving West Point, Poe put all of his energy into writing. After bouncing around the Northeast for a bit, he ended up staying in Baltimore with his aunt Maria Clem and his cousin Virginia from 1831 to 1835. While Virginia was only 7 when he first moved in, she nonetheless became his muse and the love of his life. They got married in 1836 when she was 13 years old, predating Jerry Lee Lewis's underage cousin marrying scandal by well over 100 years. Do note here that contrary contrary to popular belief, marrying such a young woman was never the norm outside of arranged marriages like with royals. In fact, the youngest average age of marriage for a woman since this sort of thing was tallied in the Western world belongs not to our medieval ancestors, but our direct ones, the baby boomers. You can see our video on our sister channel, Today I Found Out, When Did Teen Girls Stop Commonly Getting Married, for more on that one. In any event, while controversial even in his day, with Poe having to do a lot of convincing and bargaining in the form of monetary exchange to get the family to agree to the marriage, by all accounts, their marriage was mostly a happy one. In addition, Virginia was extremely devoted to Poe. She kept a picture of him under her pillow and even wrote this acrostic poem for him as a Valentine's Day gift in 1846. Ever with thee I wish to roam, dearest, my life is thine. Give me a cottage for my home, and a rich old cypress vine. Removed from the world with its sin and care, and the tattling of many tongues. Love alone shall guide us when we are there. Love shall heal my weakened lungs, and oh, the tranquil hours we'll spend, never wishing that others may see. Perfect ease we'll enjoy, without thinking to lend ourselves to the world and its glee. Ever peaceful and blissful we'll be. Unfortunately, as referenced in their poem beginning in January 1842, Virginia had developed tuberculosis. Her health progressively worsened, and by early 1846, she had told a friend, "I know I shall die soon. I know I can't get well. But I want to be as happy as possible and make Edgar happy." Virginia died on January 30th, 1847. Whatever else you can say about Poe, he apparently loved Virginia deeply. According to one observer, to quote, "He used to cry over her grave every day and kept it green with flowers." It appears that he channeled his love for Virginia into his work. In addition to the dead maiden in Annabel Lee, she is also believed to be the subject of the poem Ulalume, as well as the rare and radiant maiden Lenore of the Raven. Virginia may have also been the inspiration for Eleonora, the oblong box, and Ligeia. I saw that she must die. There had been much in her stern nature to impress me with the belief that to her death would have come without its terrors. But not so. Words are impotent to convey any just idea of the fierceness of resistance with which she wrestled with the shadow. I groaned in anguish at the pitiable spectacle of her wild desire for life. Going back to his career, before Virginia's death, Poe took a job as a literary critic for a magazine called The Southern Literary Messenger in 1835, where he wrote scathing, cutthroat reviews of his fellow authors. His time there was brief, probably just as due to his abrasive personality as his hard-hitting reviews. In the late 1830s, he began to hit his stride as a storyteller. Tales of the Grotesque and Arboresque was published, which contained some of Poe's best short stories, including The Fall of the House of Usher. In 1841, the spine-tingling Murder on the Rue Morgue was released, and the genre of detective fiction was born. The suspenseful The Telltale Heart, one of his best-known short stories, was published in 1843. But it was in 1845 that Poe became a literary sensation with the publication of The Raven, considered one of the best works of American literature and arguably the high watermark of Poe's career. It explored the gothic themes of death and loss that were so popular at the time. He was paid only $9 upon its release, about $245 to date. Around this time, he also pens the classic tale The Cask of Amontillado and the poem The Bells. When Virginia died in 1847, Edgar was completely devastated, as noted. Although he tried to continue to work, his grief, poor health, and substance abuse issues made it a constant struggle. On October the 3rd of that year, Poe was found on the streets in Baltimore and was taken to the hospital. He wasn't coherent enough to explain how he ended up there or what was wrong with him. All he managed to say was reportedly, "Lord help my poor soul." He died on October the 7th, 1847. No exact cause of death has ever been revealed. After his death, Poe suffered the indignity of posthumous mudslinging from a literary rival named Rufus Griswold. Mr. Griswold had been on the receiving end of at least one of Poe's epically critical reviews and waited until he was dead to exact his revenge. He didn't waste any time. He portrayed Poe in his obituary as a deranged alcoholic and womanizing nutjob. Griswold also rushed to write the first biography of Poe, and his mean-spirited misconceptions have been and are what most people believe about Edgar Allan Poe. Needless to say, most historians think that the crazed, drug and booze-fueled maniac we've been led to believe Poe was is very likely hyperbolic nonsense given contemporary accounts of him and his life from surviving letters of the man and those who knew him well. Of course, this was not the end to the Poe story, as Poe laid there, unmoving for decades. His legend as the master of macabre grew. His literary classics inspired legions of his fans and admirers, but no admirer has quite showed their enthusiasm for Edgar as the person or persons known as the Poe toaster. Beginning nearly 80 years after Poe's death in the 1930s, witnesses began seeing a shadowy figure dressed in black with a white scarf and a wide-brimmed hat visiting Poe's grave every January the 19th. As mentioned, this was the birth date of the legendary literary figure. In the dead of night, the individual would arrive bearing 3 roses and a bottle of cognac. When the sun rose the next morning, the roses would be in a distinctive arrangement, the bottle of cognac would be half drunk, and sometimes a note would be left sitting silently on the grave. This act of tribute was first mentioned in a 1950 Evening Sun, Baltimore's evening newspaper article, as an effort to bring attention to the church for a restoration. Through the years, the public began to learn more about this dark figure. The 3 roses represented Poe, his tuberculosis-stricken and beloved wife Virginia, and his mother-in-law Maria Clem, all 3 of whom were originally interred at the same site. The bottle of cognac spoke to Poe's long love of drinking. As for the significance of cognac specifically, a 2004 note inferred that this was a tradition of the toaster's family, rather than Poe himself. The notes that were left further shrouded this mystery. Sometimes the scribbles quoted Poe's poems and stories. Sometimes they were simple words of devotion, like, "Edgar, I haven't forgotten you." Other times, though, it cast a light on the person that was coming to visit every year. For instance, in 1993, the note cryptically mentions that a torch will be passed. In 1999, another note indicated that the original toaster had passed and a son had been assigned to this task. In 2001, merely days before the Baltimore Ravens, yes, named after the famous Poe poem, were to take on the New York Giants in the Super Bowl, the note that was left read, "The New York Giants, darkness and decay, and the Big Blue hold dominion over all. The Baltimore Ravens, 1,000 injuries they will suffer. Edgar Allan Poe, evermore." As a play on Poe's The Mask of Red Death, the note seemed to indicate the beloved Baltimore football team would lose in the Super Bowl. This angered many Baltimoreans, but the prediction would not come true. The Ravens football team beat the New York Giants and won the Super Bowl by the score of 34-7. So, who was behind all of this? Many think that the true identity of the modern toaster is one Jeff Jerome, the former curator of the Poe House and Museum in Baltimore. He himself has always been a suspect, but Jerome has repeatedly denied it, though he admits he knows more about the identity of the real individual at that time than anyone else. After becoming a tour guide at Westminster Hall in 1976, he began to do research on Poe's final resting place. That's when he found the 1950 press clipping, and on January the 20th, 1977, he found the roses and cognac waiting in the cold morning light. That day, Jerome became enamored with the Poe toaster legend. From that moment on, he and a few other Poe enthusiasts would sit in the church every January the 19th, waiting to catch a glimpse of this elusive figure. That all changed in 1990 when Life magazine published a black and white image of the Poe toaster doing his deed. Soon the Poe toaster became an international sensation. In the years that followed, scores of people would wait outside of the cemetery gate hoping to see this figure. It also spawned countless imposters. But Jerome made it his mission to preserve this tradition and make sure that the real Poe toastmaster could do his deed. He made it easier for him to get into the cemetery without dealing with the crowds, probably by leaving open the Weinhold Gate, which incidentally was used to bring in Poe's body. He arranged a string of subtle signs with the toaster himself that would indicate that he was, in fact, the real one. This arrangement worked and allowed the tradition to be continued without interference. At least this was until 2009, the bicentennial of Poe's birth. Leading up to the 160th anniversary of Poe's demise, there were clues that the Poe Toastmaster tradition may be coming to a close. Starting in 1999, when the aforementioned new toaster took over the tradition, notes like the one referencing Baltimore's football team and another one in 2004 criticizing France's involvement in the Iraq War seemed to not take the tradition seriously. In fact, Jerome admitted that certain notes had so badly marred the original toaster's motives that he has denied their existence. With over 100 people in attendance in 2009 waiting for the Poe toaster, it has officially become more of a spectacle than both the Poe toaster and Jerome would have liked. In 2010 and 2011, no toaster showed up, save for imposters, at Poe's grave for the first time in the last 70 years. In 2012, Jerome declared that if the real toaster did not show up that year, he would call the whole thing off and declare the tradition dead. No one came. Despite Jerome no longer holding out hope, spectators came out in force in 2013 to watch. Still, no one came, said Jerome in 2013 to WBAL in Baltimore. My personal feeling is the novelty wore off, and they didn't like fighting the crowds and trying to find ways to get in here, and they were afraid someone would try to tackle them with the camera right in their faces. However, this was not the end. The tradition was revived in 2016 thanks to the Maryland Historical Society, who decided to appoint a new anonymous Poe toaster who has been doing it ever since. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below. Also, subscribe to this channel. We're not on a regular schedule with videos, so hit that notification bell and you will find out when we put out a new video. And as always, thank you for watching.